welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of TNSR. One of the gifts of the Trump administration to public discourse was the idea of the deep state, the concept of unelected bureaucrats in the federal government pursuing an agenda not necessarily that of the elected officials of the executive branch. Perhaps the original deep state figure in American politics was J. Edgar Hoover, who for nearly 40 years served as head of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. On this week's episode of Horns, we hear from Beverly Gage, a historian at Yale University whose new book, G-Man, J. Edgar Hoover and the Making of the American Century, studies Hoover. She details his transformation from an idealistic reformer as he came in as the head of the Bureau of Investigation within the Justice Department, to a powerful political figure who worked for Lyndon Johnson in implementing the Civil Rights Act and for Lyndon Johnson in implementing surveillance of civil rights leaders. Gage's discussion is humorous, engaging, and helps to highlight the contradictions and elements of Hoover's story that have helped to shape the concept of American government in the years since his passing. This talk was recorded at the University of Texas, Austin. Let's listen in.
This book covers a large span of time, and I'm going to talk a little bit about Hoover's career, but I have to say, in all sincerity, that the Johnson years turned out to be some of the most fascinating to me, some of the places that I found the most interesting, and in certain ways, counterintuitive stories about J. Edgar Hoover, who he was, and what his relationship with the Johnson administration was. So my plan for today is to talk to you a little bit about the broad scope of the book, but since we're all here and all interested in Johnson, to drill down a little bit on the Johnson years, and particularly a couple of years of really remarkable collaboration between Hoover and Johnson, starting with the Kennedy assassination in 1963 and moving up into 1965. So I'm going to talk about that for about half hour, 40 minutes, and then hopefully we'll have time for a really fun and interesting Q&A. One of the features of the Hoover book is that because he was alive for so long, had his fingers in so many different things, I think in many ways, the Q&A is more important than the talk, so that we can get to the particular aspects of J. Edgar Hoover that might be of interest to all of you, in addition to what's of interest to me. So today, when most Americans think about J. Edgar Hoover, one of two images tends to come to mind. This is one, Hoover as the great surveillance king, an abuser of civil liberties, someone who was keeping files on and watching political actors and social movements at almost all levels of American life. The other, for better or worse, is captured here, which is a set of ideas about Hoover's sexuality, particularly the question of his relationship with women's clothing, which is captured here in a cartoon, as well as in the Leonardo DiCaprio biopic that came out about 10 years ago. I'm happy to talk more about either aspect of that. Both of these will come up a little bit in today's talk and a lot in the book. But for today, I want to start out with a different image. This is an image of Hoover's funeral in 1972. This is a moment in May of 1972 when Hoover died quite suddenly of a heart attack, still in office as FBI director. And I think there are a couple of interesting things about starting with this. First, Hoover's funeral was a dramatic national event. Some of you in the room may even remember it as young people. It was broadcast on all three television networks. That's how many there were at the time. It was a moment when Richard Nixon, who was president, stepped up to give the eulogy. And I think perhaps most importantly, it is a moment that offered a chance to reflect on whether you loved Hoover or hated him, and there were people in both camps by this point, was a monumental career. In fact, a lot of what people said at the moment that Hoover died in 1972 was that I cannot remember a United States of America without J. Edgar Hoover. And they meant that in many ways, a very literal sense. So by the time Hoover died in 1972, he had been director of the FBI for 48 years. Starting in 1924, this is a cartoon from 1969 as Nixon is coming into office, showing all the presidents that Hoover had served under. But just to give you a sense of the scope of Hoover's career, he was first appointed when Calvin Coolidge was president. He stayed through the 20s into the presidency of Herbert Hoover, the rise of the Great Depression, those early Depression years. They were not related to each other, though there were many jokes and comments on their similar, identical last names during those years. So he's there for the Great Depression. He is there under Franklin Roosevelt from the New Deal into the Second World War. He is there under Harry Truman for the early Cold War, the rise of the Red Scare. He remains for both terms of Dwight Eisenhower's presidency. He is there under Kennedy. He is there under Johnson. And he is there under Richard Nixon. And in fact, dies in office, as I said, in 1972. So for me as a historian, this extraordinary stretch of time is really one of the things that drew me into wanting to write a biography of J. Edgar Hoover. And I should say, when I have told people over the course of the more than a decade that I have been working on this book, their first question is often, why would you want to do that? Why would you want to spend so much time with this man who is so often thought to be one of, if not the greatest villain of the 20th century? And in many ways, it is that reputation that drew me to thinking about Hoover, and in particular for thinking about the ways that this one-dimensional image we have of him, of Hoover as a kind of rogue actor, as a villain, as someone sort of sitting alone in a back room, strong-arming and manipulating other people into submission, doesn't really capture the scope of his career. It doesn't recognize his importance over this vast swath of history. It doesn't tell us how he acquired that power that he comes to have in decades like the 1950s and 1960s. And I think in particular, it kind of lets everyone else off the hook in the sense that if we can say J. Edgar Hoover was one bad actor, then we don't have to think in other ways about broader trajectories of American politics and history that he was part of and that he came to represent. So in thinking about Hoover, I was drawn to wanting to tell a big story about the 20th century, about 20th century American politics. I was very drawn to the fact that many new files have come out since the last crop of Hoover biographies, which were mostly written in the late 80s and early 90s. No one else had really attempted this for a few decades. And now on the other side of having accomplished it, I can understand why. Because many of the same things that drew me to wanting to write about J. Edgar Hoover, this vast swath of time, this vast bureaucracy that he was the head of, and the vast files that made possible have also been one of the great challenges of, in fact, writing this book. So what I'm going to do today is just give you, as I said, a quick overview of what's in the book, talk a little bit more about the Johnson years and some of the ways that I think they reflect some of the themes I'm trying to get at with this book. But before we do that, I just want to suggest a few of these big themes that really came out to me as I began to work on J. Edgar Hoover. So first, I think Hoover is a really interesting and powerful lens for thinking about the story of the federal government over the course of the 20th century. When we tell our political history, we tend to tell it as a story of parties and elections, of Democrats and Republicans, of presidents. And Hoover allows us to step outside of that a little bit and look at some of the continuities over this time period, and in particular to think about this vast part of the American government known as the administrative state. Because, of course, what's distinctive about Hoover is that he serves all this time as an appointed official, right? Someone who is never elected to office, someone who is a deeply political person in many ways, but who makes his career really based around ideas of federal power, of government expertise, of nonpartisan service, of investigation and science, a set of ideas that we often think of as belonging to a kind of liberal or progressive tradition of a growing federal government, of faith in the power of what government can do. And this book really takes Hoover and situates him within that tradition. He, as you will see, is a child of the progressive era, comes to government with a lot of progressive ideas, and in fact is liked by many liberals and progressives in a way that we have tended to forget. At the same time, another theme that came out very strongly as I began to look at Hoover's career was that he took that tradition and combined it with a deep ideological conservatism. Conservatism on the question of race, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about as this talk goes on religion, particularly on law and order and anti-communism, which in most ways are kind of the great causes of his life. And what was interesting to me about Hoover was his ability to tape those deep conservative commitments which he was very public about, in many ways one of the great champions and heroes of conservatives in the United States, and combine them with this state-building tradition. And as I say in the introduction to the book, I really think of Hoover as a conservative state builder, which isn't actually a category that has, I think, a lot of resonance in today's politics. But nonetheless, we can see Hoover embodying both of those traditions. And then I think the last thing that I will suggest in this moment is that perhaps the most surprising thing about my own research and about the book itself is the fact that J. Edgar Hoover, over this vast swath of time, under 8 different presidents, Democrats and Republicans, was one of the most popular public figures in the United States. That begins to change a little bit in the 1960s, which are his years of greatest controversy. But in many ways, the image that he projected, his public reputation for most of the time that he was actually alive, is almost the reverse of how we tend to think about him today, when we are at a moment when almost nobody wants to claim J. Edgar Hoover. If we go back to the 1950s, Hoover is someone who is getting public opinion and popularity ratings in the 70s, 80s, and 90 percentiles. And so there's something really interesting to think about J. Edgar Hoover as a popular public hero, and also to think about how that changed. And perhaps we'll have a bit of time to talk about that as well. So now, as I suggested, I want to give you a very quick overview of how we get J. Edgar Hoover from birth to 1963, which is the moment, of course, that Lyndon Johnson enters the presidency. Then I'll talk a little bit about their dynamics and their relationship, and we can finish up with a Q&A. So J. Edgar Hoover was a child of Washington, a creature of Washington from the moment that he was born. He was born in Washington, D.C. in 1895, just a few blocks away from the Capitol. And in many ways, G-Man is really a story about the city of Washington, its influence on this particular actor, but also its rise to power as first a national and then in many ways a global center of power. Hoover is in the thick of that from the moment that he's born. These are some pictures of him as a child in Washington. Our only known picture of J. Edgar Hoover in a dress up here. And Washington came to represent what I said are kind of the two big political themes of this book. On the one hand, a story about government power and government service. On the other hand, a story about a deep sort of social conservatism in particular, because both of those are present in the Washington of his childhood in very dramatic ways. In the late 19th century, Washington is kind of a backwater. The federal government isn't all that big, but Hoover is already part of a family that is employed in the federal civil service, and he grows up surrounded by a tradition of nonpartisan government service. Residents of Washington cannot vote. J. Edgar Hoover never votes, and he never joins a political party, and he is surrounded by that ethos from the moment of his birth. The other thing that's happening in Washington in the late 19th and early 20th century, as in many parts of the South, as well as some to degree the North, is that it is undergoing a pretty rigid process of racial segregation. That is an active process. When Hoover is a child, he goes to segregated schools, and at the very moment that he enters the federal government, it too is becoming segregated in much more rigid ways. So Hoover is getting a racial education through the city of Washington, through the institutions that he's interacting with there, that he's going to carry on into the way that he builds the FBI and, of course, the way that he polices the nation. So he goes to Washington public schools. He is not from an especially elite family, an established Washington family, but not an elite one. He is a middle-class child going to a segregated white public school in Washington. And when he goes to college, he stays in Washington as well. Goes to George Washington University, which at that point was primarily a night school for aspiring government bureaucrats. You worked for the government by day, you went to GW at night to become, in Hoover's case, a lawyer. He worked at the Library of Congress. While he was in college, it's one of the ways he learned to classify things and build files and retrieve information. He studied at GW at night. One of the most interesting institutions that I encountered during Hoover's early years was his college fraternity, which was a fraternity known as the Kappa Alpha Order. And to the degree that we know, right, that Hoover is many ways quite an outspoken figure on race and racist by the 1960s. One of my questions was, where did these racial ideas come from? Some of them we can see forming in Washington of his youth. Others, his fraternity, Kappa Alpha, was an explicitly Southern segregationist fraternity, had been founded in 1865 to carry on the memory of Robert E. Lee, and by the time Hoover joins it in the teens, has some of the country's most famous segregationist voices among its alums. That little picture in the top right there is the cover of The Klansman, which was a novel written by Thomas Dixon, ultimately became the basis for the film Birth of a Nation. Thomas Dixon was a famous Kappa Alpha, as were many other kind of prominent Southern Democrats during this era. Hoover remains very committed to this fraternity throughout his life, and you can see up there an honorary award that he gets in the 1960s from Kappa Alpha. He graduates in a very important year in American history, spring of 1917. And since we have so many historians in the audience, I don't need to explain, it's the moment that the United States is entering World War I. There are many hinge points where things could have gone differently with Hoover. I think the fact that he graduates in 1917 is one. He does not join the Army. Instead, he goes into a Justice Department, which has a vast array of new duties, many of them involving things like surveillance of dissenters, surveillance of German citizens, watching draft dodgers. And so from the moment that Hoover enters the Justice Department, he is trained in that kind of work. His first job is in German internment and registration during the First World War. These are some images from that work. Next, he's so good at it that he is promoted in 1919 at the age of 24 to head up a new division in the Justice Department known as the Radical Division, which is the federal government's first peacetime surveillance effort, really aimed at the American left, in this particular case, mainly at communists and anarchists in the wake of the Bolshevik Revolution. He is, as a very young man, a behind-the-scenes architect of the Palmer raids, deportation raids aimed at anarchists and communists. And this is actually the place that I first encountered him as a historical figure. Mark mentioned that I wrote a book about a bomb attack on Wall Street in 1920, very much part of the Red Scare politics of that moment. And Hoover was there as a man in his mid-20s, helping to conduct that investigation. And what struck me in that moment were the ways in which he was forming many of the anti-communist ideas that he was going to carry on for many years. He manages to survive the backlash against the Palmer raids. Then he also manages to survive the scandals of the Harding years when he was the assistant director of the Bureau of Investigation. And in 1924, he is appointed head of this little organization within the Justice Department, a few hundred agents known as the Bureau of Investigation. He keeps that job for the next 48 years. It's a little bit like being a tenured professor. It's kind of the last bastion of actually these lifetime jobs. One of the interesting things to note, when Hoover becomes bureau director as a 29-year-old in 1924, he really comes into office as a reformer. There have been corruption scandals, there have been political abuse scandals, and Hoover promises that he's not going to do any of those things. He's going to be about merit and expertise and professionalism. He's going to hire lawyers and accountants. He's going to clean things up, and he is going to have a very focused, professional, white-collar bureau. Here are some of the many things that he vows never ever to do. He will never open Americans' mail. He will never use wiretapping, et cetera, et cetera. So he falls away from this vision a little bit over time. But in fact, it remains a very important part of his early reputation and in many ways part of the FBI's culture as that goes along. He spends his first decade really focused on these kinds of bureaucratic reforms, on hiring men who are a lot like him. He hires very heavily out of George Washington University. These are some of the early bureau officials that come out of his college and also out of his fraternity. The most important of them, this man, Clyde Tolson, who goes on not only to be Hoover's number 2 at the Bureau for most of his career. He is a GW graduate, but of course also the most important relationship in Hoover's life. So the book goes into a lot about both their professional, but especially their personal relationship. They are essentially social partners for the next 40 plus years. One of the puzzles of their relationship is that it's really quite public. So Lyndon Johnson, at the moment that Hoover dies, his first call is to Clyde Tolson to say, "You have my sympathies." They had socialized together. Hoover and Tolson were really in Washington and elsewhere treated quite widely as a couple. This is a photo of them together at the Bureau celebrating one of Tolson's Bureau anniversaries in the 1930s. What I like about it is it looks a little bit like a wedding photo. There are challenges to reading their relationship and to understanding exactly what their most intimate relationship was. Some of my favorite sources for trying to think about that were Hoover's private photo collection, which particularly in the 30s and 40s documents his many vacations with Tolson. And I'm happy to talk more about all of this. Here's a beach photo of Hoover taken by Tolson. Here is a photo of Tolson looking into the camera at Hoover. They're generally quite intimate photos, and I think suggest, a pretty deep and intimate relationship between the men. At the Bureau, they set out together to build up many of the policies and areas of jurisdiction that are still part of the Bureau today: fingerprints, the FBI crime reports, gathering crime statistics, setting up the FBI lab. That's a lot of what Hoover's focused on in the 20s. And in fact, this is the image of the FBI. This is a publicity shot of the FBI in the 1920s, right? They liked filing cabinets. They wanted you to know that they knew how to file things, that they were white-collar guys working in an office setting, and that was their image. And then suddenly, in 1935, that image changes really dramatically, and a lot of that change happens due to Franklin Roosevelt and due to the challenges of the New Deal. So it's during the New Deal years, first of all, that Hoover becomes a national celebrity, and I think as importantly, that the FBI comes to look like what we know today. First of all, it gets its name, the FBI, in the 1930s, and essentially is a New Deal alphabet agency like the WPA or the CCC. That's where we get the FBI. And Hoover moves into three really important areas of work that the FBI holds on to, again, to the present day. Here he is with Franklin Roosevelt signing crime legislation. And the first thing that the FBI moves into is federal law enforcement in much more significant ways through battles with bank robbers and gangsters. They begin to carry guns, have jurisdiction over a whole host of new federal crimes, and engage in showdowns with famous outlaws such as John Dillinger. This is when that image comes into being, again, due to essentially New Deal legislation that says the federal government is not only going to be doing Social Security, but we're also going to be engaging in a war on crime. Second thing he learns to do during the Roosevelt years is publicity. He begins to build up a massive publicity apparatus and public relations apparatus that becomes very important to his own public image and the image of the FBI. They become known and promote themselves as the G-Men. The title of this book is G-Man, that stands for government man, and I think it captures something really important, which is that during the New Deal years, they are sort of the avenging symbols of a newly empowered federal government. That's how people thought about them. That's what they stood for. And then as the war comes along, the FBI begins to take on its second big box of duties, which is intelligence work of varying sorts. They have jurisdiction in Latin America during the war. At home, they are in charge of domestic espionage and sabotage and subversion. But the key is they have to pivot and not only be a federal criminal law enforcement agency, but also learn to become an intelligence agency, and that happens during the war. And the FBI goes through a massive expansion, and it's really World War II, as with so much of our federal government, where the FBI grows and grows. This is the FBI's fingerprinting division that takes over the Washington Armory during the war. And you can see how many more filing cabinets there are now. So they're still kind of attached to that. And then I'll just move quickly on to what becomes part 3 of the book. If part 1 is his childhood, his coming of age in Washington, part 2 are these years of institution building that are the 20s, 30s into the mid 40s. Part 3 is about this moment in the late 40s and 50s where Hoover has built his institution. He's acquired quite a lot of power, and he begins to use that power to really shape American politics in his own vision. And his number one issue in the 40s and into the 50s is the issue of communism. We tend to associate this with Joseph McCarthy, but I think in many ways Hoover is the more powerful actor. He's there before McCarthy, he's there during McCarthy, he's there after McCarthy, and Hoover is the one that really builds institutions that last and pursue anti-communist policies for a much longer period of time. Here he is in front of the Congress testifying on the question of communism. There's a lot of interesting material in the book about how he builds these relations with Congress. He's here with Joseph McCarthy. They're on vacation together in California. So they had a friendly relationship, though ultimately Hoover thinks that McCarthy is a bit of a bad actor. Hoover's on your right and McCarthy's on your left there. Tolson is standing next to McCarthy. Hoover uses the issue of communism as well to build a very substantial popular constituency. The FBI works closely with organizations like the American Legion, the Daughters of the American Revolution, to build a sort of grassroots army to carry out J. Edgar Hoover's vision. And he engages not only in these kinds of national security investigations on espionage, looking into the Communist Party, working with Congress to expose communism, but also really makes himself into a powerful cultural figure of varying sorts. So he spends a lot of time lecturing American parents about how to keep their children from growing up to be either criminals or communists. I thought you would appreciate this one in particular, since we're here in Texas. He also becomes a quite outspoken advocate of religiosity, of Sunday school, of church-going as the essential tool for fighting atheistic communism. And I think it's one of the most important aspects of Hoover's career during these years is that he does not only frame communism as a relatively narrow national security issue, but in fact engages in this much broader cultural campaign. All right, so that gets us up to the 1960s. So now I want to pivot for these last few minutes and talk a little bit about Johnson and Hoover, and in particular to talk about the question of civil rights and the ways in which they collaborated both to achieve some of the great civil rights victories of the Johnson years and then also to surveil and constrain the civil rights movement in many, many ways. So Hoover and Johnson, as Mark suggested, were old friends by the time Johnson became president in 1963. They had been neighbors on the same block of 30th Place in Washington, D.C. This is Hoover's house. One of the interesting things about this is, I don't know if you can see sort of right above the bottom there, but this advertises this as a safely restricted neighborhood. That means that this was a neighborhood that was under racial covenants. All homeowners were white, but they lived just a few doors apart from each other. Johnson was across the street. And there are lots of stories from these years that the Johnson family was on 30th Place about the girls running up and cutting the roses in Hoover's garden and everyone joking that, haha, they had stolen things from the FBI director. But Hoover was sort of part of the Johnson family social orbit. The brunches, they like to walk their dogs on the street. And so they built over the course of the 40s and 50s a fairly close relationship. And I think in many ways had a similar way of thinking about political power. They both really liked to kind of get into the backroom story. And you can imagine that many of their conversations in those years consisted of that. It's clear that Johnson also saw Hoover as a political asset. And these are a series of photos from 1959 when Johnson manages, as he's clearly thinking about the presidential nomination, thinks Hoover is going to be an asset. He persuades Hoover to come to Austin and be part of a charitable event in Austin. They head out to the LBJ Ranch. This is, I brought this especially for you, Hoover in his cowboy hat here in Austin. But I think it suggests both the level of their friendship. Tolson is with Hoover on this journey, and also the ways in which Johnson wants to ally himself publicly with Hoover, right? He wants Hoover in Texas, and I think in many ways thinks of Hoover as sort of an anchor, someone who has a lot of respect among Southern Democrats, sometimes some ambivalence from Southern Democrats as well, but someone who is going to be a political asset. Of course, 1960 comes along. Johnson does not have the nomination. Hoover is also very good friends in the 1950s with this man here, Richard Nixon. Who is, of course, the Republican candidate. Hoover is hoping that Nixon will win in 1960. That doesn't happen, and instead John Kennedy becomes president, Lyndon Johnson vice president. And what I like about this picture is that that sort of captures how Hoover felt about the Kennedy administration. None of them look very happy to be there together. And the Kennedy years are in many ways some of the most contentious. They're one of the moments where you can imagine that Hoover might have been forced out or stepped down from the FBI. Who do we have to thank for the fact that that didn't happen? It's going to be Lyndon Johnson. At any rate, partly because Hoover was on the outs with the Kennedy administration, he and Johnson are pretty close during Johnson's vice presidential years as well. As near as we can tell, they spent a lot of time complaining about Robert Kennedy. J. Edgar Hoover especially doesn't like Robert Kennedy because Hoover was a very buttoned up guy. You can imagine your FBI, right, your sort of classic FBI G-man in his suit and his hat. And he really hated that Robert Kennedy loosened his tie, put his feet on the desk as Attorney General. And there are a series of clashes between Hoover and the Kennedys. As I said, he and Johnson remain pretty friendly throughout those years. And then, of course, comes November of 1963 and the Kennedy assassination. Johnson is thrust into the presidency, and the FBI is thrust into a major, major crisis. First of all, are they going to be responsible for the Kennedy assassination investigation? That's one of the big questions in the first moments. And then secondly, once Lee Harvey Oswald has also been killed, how is the FBI going to investigate, and how are they going to persuade the public that, in fact, Oswald has been the assassin if there's not going to be a trial, if there's not going to be that kind of public reckoning? And so you see during that first week after the assassination, a real collaboration and a set of very intensive conversations between Hoover and Johnson over how to handle this situation, over the role that the FBI is going to play. Johnson assuring Hoover that this is not going to be a disaster for the FBI. And then, in fact, he is on Hoover's side. And as he's settling on the question of the Warren Commission, he sells this to Hoover and gets Hoover on board, not only by consulting him about who the members of the commission should be, but also by saying, look, Edgar, I promise you, the Warren Commission's really just going to be here to rubber stamp the work of the FBI. You're still going to be the central actor. You're the central player, and you're the one that I believe in. That's not quite how the Warren Commission ultimately plays out. This is a Herblock cartoon from 1964 showing that even though the Warren Commission report is ultimately goes pretty easy on the FBI, it is critical in certain ways. Hoover's very upset about that. And this is sort of a tribute to J. Edgar Hoover's love of good publicity. And they're saying, wait, the Warren Commission report doesn't quite fit into my library of such things like J. Edgar Hoover's Superman, the press clippings of J. Edgar Hoover, FBI publicity stories on J. Edgar Hoover, et cetera, et cetera. The one thing that Hoover does gain from Johnson, and the one thing that is most valuable to him over the course of the Warren Commission period, comes in May of 1964, when Johnson does something pretty extraordinary, which is that he exempts Hoover from mandatory federal retirement at the age of 70. In the natural course of events, on January 1st, 1965, Hoover was going to turn 70. He would have to retire. This is a ceremony in which Johnson basically exempts him from that and effectively makes Hoover FBI director for life. So why does Lyndon Johnson do that? I think there are a couple of reasons to think about. One is that, of course, they had this history of friendship. I think Johnson genuinely trusted Hoover. I think Johnson, like many political actors, may also have been concerned about what Hoover might have done out of office, the kinds of information and access that he had. But I think Johnson also primarily saw Hoover as being valuable for two reasons. One, as he's moving into this great struggle over civil rights legislation, Hoover is really a very, very popular figure among conservative Democrats. And I think Johnson sees him as an asset in that sense. And perhaps most importantly, Johnson sees Hoover as someone who can be politically useful to him by putting the FBI to work on the Johnson agenda. And that's really what happens over the course of the Johnson presidency. A really important figure in this is a man named Cartha DeLoach, known as Deke DeLoach. So if you look at the Johnson tapes, you look at the Johnson daily logs, you will see DeLoach's name all over those. He was the liaison between the FBI and the Johnson White House. He was particularly close with Walter Jenkins, who was one of Johnson's chief aides, and the FBI plays a very important and interesting role in a scandal that emerges in October of 1964, right before the election, when Jenkins is arrested having sex with another man in the YMCA in Washington. There is a big scandal. The Goldwater campaign raises this. Johnson turns to Hoover and says, I need you to come up with a report. I need it to come out fast. And I basically need you to say there are no national security concerns here, right? The idea with homosexuality at the time was that gay people could be blackmailed into revealing national security information. Hoover does exactly what Johnson wants. It's just a couple of weeks before the election, comes out with a report saying, no big deal, everybody move on. But of course, the great issue both for Hoover and Johnson in 1964 is the civil rights movement and the passage of civil rights legislation. And I think you can see both of these aspects that I talked about with Hoover. On the one hand, a real belief in federal power, in the legitimacy and use of federal power, and of respect for federal law, of a certain kind of professional service. And then on the other hand, Hoover is also deploying the FBI to conduct widespread surveillance of civil rights actors, often with the understanding and knowledge of Lyndon Johnson, and sometimes at Lyndon Johnson's urging. And I think you can see that even in the Kennedy years, we have both of these aspects at work in the FBI's relationship with the civil rights movement. On the one hand, widespread surveillance, including of figures like King, often on an anti-communist logic. And then on the other hand, a real resistance to federal authority in much of the South. This is from the early 1960s, pre-Johnson, and you can see that federal law enforcement is often seen as a force on behalf of civil rights. One of the FBI's nicknames during these years was the Federal Bureau of Integration, and that was not meant as a compliment by the people who were doing it. So when Johnson comes into office, the FBI immediately sees that after being a little bit in the wilderness during the Kennedy years, they are now going to be empowered to do kind of what they want on the civil rights question, and particularly on the surveillance question. This is a memo from December 1963, right? Just a few weeks after the Kennedy assassination. Johnson is now in office. FBI officials gather and they say, we can now go much, much more aggressively against Martin Luther King, who they have already been wiretapping, but they're going to begin bugging his hotel rooms and conducting a whole series of surveillance and disruption operations. So the FBI understands the Johnson presidency to have empowered them to do this in much more aggressive ways, but for the early part of 1964, they end up holding back, in large part because they understand that Johnson's chief agenda is the passage of the Civil Rights Act. And in fact, Johnson goes to Hoover and says, I want your help on this. We want to make this happen. And so we have this really, I think, paradoxical story in which, on the one hand, Johnson is often pushing the FBI to do some of its best and most honorable work to make federal authority work on behalf of civil rights in the American South, and on the other hand is licensing a whole series of pretty dramatic and often quite cruel enterprises. So I will just offer a few of the highlights of that story. One is the murder of the 3 civil rights workers in Mississippi, which happens just as Johnson is about to sign the Civil Rights Act. The FBI, at Johnson's behest, launches a major investigation, ultimately a successful investigation under lots of pressure and difficulty. Johnson wants Hoover on board with the Civil Rights Act, and here he he is. I saw in the Johnson Library, we have the much more famous portrait of pens being handed out with Martin Luther King standing there. Well, here's Hoover getting one of the pens after the passage of the Civil Rights Act. Johnson was very attuned to this imagery and to the idea that the FBI now was going to be responsible for a lot of civil rights enforcement in the South. And one of the first things he does is persuade Hoover personally to go to Jackson, Mississippi, and open an FBI office there. That happens just days after the passage of the Civil Rights Act. Hoover goes. That's Tolson whispering to him from across the room, and that's Deke DeLoach in the background. And perhaps most dramatically, in July of 1964, you can hear this on the Johnson tapes. Johnson says to Hoover, I have been watching what you've done to the communists. You've got people inside their organization. You're watching them. You know their every move. I want you to do that with the Ku Klux Klan. Right? Lots of people think that the FBI is much more fond of the Klan than inclined to go after it. But in fact, the FBI launches a very major set of operations against the Ku Klux Klan and other white supremacist neo-Nazi groups in the South, one of which is a program called COINTELPRO White Hate. We tend to think of COINTELPRO, the FBI's big surveillance and disruption operation during these years, as being aimed at the left, and most of it was aimed at the left. But in fact, they were also doing many of those same things to the Klan and to other white supremacist groups. So that's sort of the pro-civil rights, the Johnson as civil rights president story of his collaboration with Hoover in 1964. And here are some pieces that really complicate that a little bit. One, in August of 1964, at the Democratic National Convention, when the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party is making a bid to unseat the all-white delegation, there are lots of civil rights protesters, as you can see, out on the sidewalks seeking to really make the Democratic Party claim the mantle of civil rights in a serious way. Johnson's very concerned about these protests. He gets Hoover to set up special squads at the Democratic Convention who are conducting surveillance, wiretapping, bugging, infiltration of many civil rights groups, including Martin Luther King himself. You've got FBI agents at the conventions posing as reporters, and they are reporting back to the Johnson White House several times a day through Walter Jenkins and Bill Moyers about what's going on. So a pretty outrageous set of political surveillance operations at Johnson's behest. And even Hoover says to DeLoach, wow, this is kind of crossing the line. I wish Johnson hadn't asked us to do this, but since he had, we will go ahead with that. And once Johnson is elected in November of 64, as during the period in which he first becomes president, Hoover really takes that then as a license to expand his campaign against the movement in general, but King in particular. Right after Johnson's election, Hoover holds a famous press conference in which he talks about a lot of issues, but the one quote that comes out of that most famously is that he calls Martin Luther King the most notorious liar in America. It produces a big set of debates and criticisms of Hoover for that. He finally has a kind of public sit-down with Martin Luther King in which they say, okay, really, we've come to an agreement. Everything is fine. But of course, everything was not fine. At the same time that the FBI is doing this publicly, many people are asking Johnson to force Hoover out. At this moment, Johnson says, I'm not going to do that. He's kind of amused by the whole thing. And it's the moment that his famous quote that he'd rather have Hoover inside the tent pissing out than outside the tent pissing in is expressed. But as this public campaign is going on against King, there's also a private campaign of not only surveillance, but disruption and harassment that the FBI takes on. This is an anonymous letter that the FBI mailed to Martin Luther King in December of 1964, sort of late November into December of 64, accompanied by a reel of tapes that had been acquired of King's extramarital sexual activity in his hotel rooms. This was probably my best archival find over the course of doing this research, which is to say that that letter had been public before, but this is what we had, this highly redacted version, in the National Archives in a reprocessed set of Hoover files. I came across an unredacted version of this letter, and this is ultimately becomes known as the quote-unquote suicide letter, but it's basically an anonymous dirty trick allegedly coming from a Black admirer of King's saying, as it turns out, you're a horrible man, and I no longer have faith in you, and urging King, as you can see, there's only one thing left for you to do, you know what it is. King interpreted that as a call to commit suicide. This is at the moment that he's receiving the Nobel Prize. So the FBI is engaged in those campaigns, and I think one of the questions for admirers of Lyndon Johnson is how much did Johnson know about that sort of thing? It's not clear that he knew about that operation. Very few people did in its details, but it's also clear that Johnson knew a great deal about the forms of surveillance and harassment and disruption that were going on. This is a memo from December of 1964, this moment in which they are discussing, it's a memo from Deloach to another FBI official in which he's saying, I've gone to the White House, I talked with Bill Moyers, Bill Moyers talked with the president, and they say, go ahead, and as you can see, disseminate the report, the monograph. What that is a compilation of things that the FBI had learned about King's alleged association with communists, but also about his sex life that they were going to try to spread around Washington to discredit King, and as you can see, to some degree, with the knowledge of the White House. So there are other things to say about what happens from this point on, but as I said, I do want to leave time for Q&A, and I'm happy to talk about what happens from this point on in the Johnson presidency, other aspects of Hoover's career, but I think those few critical months in 1964 really illustrate these two themes, which is on the one hand, Hoover could be pushed, especially by a figure like Lyndon Johnson, to use his bureaucracy, the power of the federal government in really important and in certain ways progressive and liberal ways. And on the other hand, he had not only with the cooperation of Lyndon Johnson, but with the cooperation of many of the presidents that he worked under, built up an apparatus that was about policing, constraining American democracy, social movements, particularly movements led by Black Americans, and that's a part of his legacy as well.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.